He held her hand in the dark, and his voice broke like a man who had forgotten how to pray. "Don't you dare die on me. I just found you." He was the biggest man in the Wyoming Territory. He had fought wolves with his bare hands and faced down gunmen without flinching. But that night, kneeling beside a woman half his size, Elijah Stone was terrified. This is the story of how a mail-order bride from Philadelphia brought a giant to his knees and how three mountain brothers became a family. She was 64 years old the last time she told the story. The porch was wide and warm, built from timber her husband had cut with his own hands 4 decades ago. The rocking chair beside her was oversized, made for a man who had never fit comfortably into anything designed for ordinary people. The wood was worn smooth at the armrest, polished by 10,000 evenings of sitting, watching the sun go down behind the Bighorn Mountains. A little girl came running across the yard, 5 years old, hair, the color of wild honey, eyes like amber whiskey. She wrapped her arms around her grandmother's leg and looked up with the kind of trust that only grandchildren possess. "Grandma, tell me the story again. About Grandpa and the wolves." The old woman smiled. It was a smile that still held traces of the girl she had been, the girl who had stepped off a stagecoach into ankle-deep mud in a town called Redemption Gulch 40 years before. A girl who had been 24, terrified and completely alone. "Which part, darling, the wolves, the blizzard, or the part where your grandfather told me to leave and I refused?" "The beginning, when you first saw him and you thought he was a bear." The old woman laughed, a sound as warm as firelight, and her eyes drifted toward the mountains where the last snow was melting into silver streams. "It was October 1874. I was 24 years old, and I had never been more afraid or more alive in my entire life." Before we continue, if you are new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment down below telling me where you are listening from tonight. Now let us go back to 1874, back to a girl named Clara Bennett and the three mountain men who changed her life forever. The stagecoach had been rattling for 6 hours straight, and Clara Bennett had long since stopped trying to keep her teeth from clacking together. Every rut in the road jolted through the thin wooden bench and up her spine. The dust came through the window cracks in fine clouds that settled on her navy blue dress and turned it gray. She held her carpet bag in her lap with both hands, knuckles white. Inside it was everything she owned in the world. 2 changes of clothes, a worn Bible with her father's handwriting in the margins, a tin of peppermints she had bought in Cheyenne when the loneliness had gotten so sharp she needed something sweet just to keep going, and a letter. One letter folded so many times the creases had nearly worn through. She took it out now and read it again, though she had memorized every word. "Miss Bennett, your letter received. I make no false promises. Life here is honest but hard. If you come, you will have a roof, food, and respect. That is all I can offer. If that is enough, the supply wagon runs Wednesdays. E. Stone." No poetry, no promises of love, no flowered language about building a life together. Just 3 things offered plainly: a roof, food, and respect. In the world Clara had just fled, a man named Harrison Crawford had promised her the moon. He had promised her security, comfort, a place in Philadelphia society. He had spoken beautiful words in beautiful rooms, and every single word had been a gilded lie. E. Stone's letter was the ugliest, bluntest piece of correspondence Clara had ever received, and it was the first honest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. "Last stop, Redemption Gulch." The driver's voice cracked like a whip. Clara tucked the letter back into her bag, squared her shoulders, and stepped out. Her boots sank into mud up to the ankle, cold, thick, sucking mud that swallowed the fine leather shoes she had brought from Philadelphia, the last remnant of her former life. She pulled her foot free with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle and stood there in the middle of what generously might be called a street. Redemption Gulch looked exactly as its name suggested: a wound in the side of the mountain, a gash cut into granite and filled with gray timber and gray men. The main road stretched perhaps 200 yards, planked with wood, in places raw mud in others. On one side stood the Broken Spur Saloon, its doors hanging on leather hinges, its porch sagging under the weight of 3 miners who had stopped talking to stare at her. On the other side sat Hawkins General Supply, smelling of kerosene and blasting powder. At the far end, a small church with a leaning steeple. The bell had not rung in years because no one bothered to pull the rope. The air smelled of sulfur from the nearby hot springs of horse sweat of unwashed wool, and underneath it all, the cold, clean scent of pine coming down from the high ridges. That pine smell was the only thing that gave Clara any hope at all. Three miners on the saloon porch had stopped their conversation entirely. One whistled low and appraising the way a man might whistle at a horse he was considering buying. The second spat tobacco juice near her boot. The third, tall and gaunt, with clouded eyes, stood and walked toward her. Well, well, what did the stage bring us today? You lost, sweetheart. Clara did not look at him. She had learned in Philadelphia that a reaction was exactly what men like this wanted. Harrison Crawford had taught her that lesson well, though he would have been horrified to know it. Harrison never whistled or spat. Harrison used silk gloves and soft words to do his damage. But the intent was the same. She scanned the street looking for anyone who might help. A woman, any woman. But the street was empty of women. Redemption Gulch was a world built by men for men, and the absence of feminine presence hung over the town like dust. An old man stood on the porch of the saloon, broom in hand, watching her with sharp eyes that contradicted his yellowed teeth and sun-cracked face. He was perhaps 65, wearing a straw hat so faded it had lost all color, and he held the broom like a man who had held rifles before and did not find the broom nearly as interesting. "Stone Ranch," he called out. "You the mail-order bride?" Clara straightened. "I am Miss Clara Bennett. I have come to meet Mr. E. Stone." The old man, whose name was Pete, and whom everyone in Redemption Gulch simply called Old Pete, looked at her the way a man looks at a card hand he cannot quite read. "E. Stone, that would be Elijah." He scratched his chin. "He did not mention you were coming this week. But that man would not mention if his own hair was on fire." Then his face went serious. "Listen, Missy, I have got to tell you something before you go up that mountain. The Stone boys, they are good men. Hard men, but good. Best men in this territory, and I would stake my life on that." Clara's stomach tightened. Boys, plural. 3 of them, sweetheart. 3 brothers, 1 homestead. The ground shifted under Clara's feet, and it had nothing to do with the mud. 3 men, 1 cabin. Her alone 1,000 miles from anyone who knew her name. "Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "The advertisement mentioned a rancher. Singular." Old Pete leaned his broom against the wall and looked at her with something close to pity. But it was not pity she saw in his eyes. It was something stranger. It was conviction. "This mountain chose you, girl. Do not fight it." She did not understand what he meant. She would not understand for months. But 40 years later, standing on that wide porch with her granddaughter at her feet, she would remember Old Pete's words and know that he had been the first person in Redemption Gulch to tell her the truth. Pete brought her to Martha, his wife, who ran the boarding house at the edge of town. Martha was 57 with silver hair braided tight, a back straight as a fence post, and a shotgun behind the counter that she kept loaded with the casual ease of a woman who had used it before. Martha poured Clara real tea. Not coffee, which was all anyone drank in Redemption Gulch, but actual tea brewed from leaves she kept in a tin behind the flour barrel. In this territory where coffee was currency and tea was legend, the gesture was an act of tenderness. "The Stone brothers built that homestead from nothing," Martha said, setting the cup down. "After the war, Elijah came here with an axe and 2 younger brothers. 10 years they turned raw wilderness into a working ranch. A man who builds like that does not destroy." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "What happened to Elijah's wife?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. "That is his story to tell. But I will say this, when a man carries grief the way Elijah Stone carries his, it is because the love was real, and real love does not die. It just waits." That night in the narrow bed in Martha's boarding house, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the wind come down from the mountains, and she thought about the life she had left behind. She thought about her father. Reverend Daniel Bennett had been a quiet man, with large hands and a gentle voice. He had not been a wealthy minister. His parish was small, his congregation poor. But he had read widely, loved deeply, and raised Clara to believe that a person's worth was measured not by what they possessed, but by what they endured. He died 2 years ago. Pneumonia. And with him went Clara's only protection in the world. She had taken the position as governess in the Crawford household because she had no other choice. The Crawfords were banking people, old money, high society. Clara taught their younger children French and arithmetic and tried to make herself invisible. But Harrison Crawford, the eldest son, had noticed her. He noticed the way she moved through rooms, the way she read aloud to the children, the way firelight caught her honey blonde hair. He pursued her with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who had never been told no. And when Clara did tell him no clearly and firmly and without ambiguity, Harrison did not hear the word. He heard a challenge. His sister Penelope hated Clara, not for any offense Clara had committed, but because Harrison's interest in the governess was an embarrassment to the family name. Penelope took a diamond brooch from their mother's jewelry case and hid it in Clara's vanity. The accusation followed within the hour. Clara remembered the last night in the Crawford house with a clarity that cut like glass. Harrison had come to the schoolroom after dark, closed the door behind him, and stood between Clara and the only exit. "They found the brooch in your vanity, Clara. Mother wants you arrested. Father wants you hanged." His voice had been soft, almost tender. "But I told them I would handle it. Marry me, Clara. I will make the charges disappear." She had looked into his eyes, gray and cold and certain, and she had seen her entire future collapse into a single corridor with no doors. "I did not take the brooch, Harrison. Your sister planted it." The mask fell. "It does not matter who took it. What matters is who they believe. And they will always believe us over you, Clara. Always." She had fled that night, sold her father's silver locket, the only thing she had left of the woman who had died giving her life, bought a train ticket heading west, and on a crumpled newspaper in a third-class rail car, she had found the advertisement. A rancher in Wyoming Territory seeking a wife. Now here she was, mud on her shoes, fear in her chest, and 3 strangers waiting for her on a mountain. The supply wagon left at dawn. The driver was a man named Hank, who said exactly 4 words to Clara during the entire 4-hour journey: "Hold on and watch yourself." The trail climbed through Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, switchbacking up the ridge in a series of hairpin turns that made Clara grip the wagon rail until her fingers ached. The air grew colder as they climbed, thinner, sharper. Snow appeared on the ground in patches, then in sheets, then in deep blankets that muffled the sound of the mule's hooves. The world narrowed to the trail, the trees, and the growing silence. Then the trees opened into a clearing, and Clara saw a stone ranch. It was not a cabin, it was a homestead, rough but real, built with the kind of care that only men who understood winter could achieve. The main house was constructed from ponderosa pine logs, each trunk as thick as a man's embrace, hewn flat, notched, and stacked without gaps. The roof was cedar shingle, pitched steep so snow would slide. A granite chimney, every stone hauled from the creek by hand, breathed gray smoke into the cold air. Beside the main house stood a stable with 4 horses visible, inside a hay barn stacked to the rafters with winter feed, a small workshop with tools hanging on pegs in precise rows, and an outdoor kitchen with a clay bread oven. A split-rail fence enclosed the grazing area where 20 head of cattle moved slowly in the cold. A flock of chickens pecked at the frozen ground near the porch. 2 shepherd dogs raised their heads as the wagon approached. Everything was clean, orderly, maintained. This was the work of men who knew how to build, how to repair, how to maintain. No decoration, no waste. Every board, every nail, every fence post served a purpose. Clara saw the first brother before she saw the homestead clearly. He was splitting wood in the front yard shirtless despite the near-freezing temperature, and the axe rose and fell with a precision that spoke of 10,000 repetitions. Each stroke split the oak log cleanly in 2. He did not seem to notice the cold. He seemed to be part of it. When the wagon rolled into the yard, he stopped, buried the axe head in the chopping block, and looked at Clara with amber eyes that glowed like a hawk's. He was tall, well over 6 feet, young perhaps 27, with dirty blonde hair that hung wild past his ears and a small scar across the bridge of his nose. His body was the kind that labor made, not vanity. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, hands that could crack walnuts without effort. "Well, well," he said, "Elijah's bride." He looked her over from head to boot, not with hunger, but with the frank assessment of a man evaluating a horse's teeth. "You are smaller than I expected. Can you even lift a water bucket?" Clara climbed down from the wagon and stood straight, the top of her head barely reaching his chest. "I can lift a book, Mr. Stone, and a book is heavier than you think." His face split into a wide grin, white teeth dangerous and genuine at the same time. She bites. I like it. He turned toward the cabin and bellowed, "Caleb, get out here!" The bride arrived. The cabin door opened. The second brother emerged, wiping his hands on an apron. He was slightly shorter than the first, perhaps 6'3", but just as solidly built. His face was gentler, his amber eyes warmer, and he wore a quiet half-smile that suggested he found most of the world privately amusing. "Miss Bennett? Welcome. I am Caleb." He offered his hand, careful and slow. His grip was firm, but measured the grip of a man who knew his own strength and chose not to use it. "I hope the road was not too hard on you." Clara took his hand. It was warm, calloused, and surprisingly gentle. "Thank you, Caleb." The road was educational. She looked around the yard. "And Elijah?" The two brothers exchanged a glance. The younger one snorted. "Up on the ridge," Caleb said gently. "Checking the trap line. He will be back by dark." "He knows I'm coming today." An awkward silence. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "He knows. He is just processing." "More like hiding," the younger one added, still grinning. Clara felt her stomach clench. She had traveled 1,700 miles, sold the last thing her mother had given her, and the man who had invited her could not even bring himself to be present when she arrived. "I see," she said, and her voice was level. The kind of level that takes years of standing before powerful people to develop. "Well, I have come a very long way. If Mr. Stone does not want me here, I would appreciate knowing sooner rather than later. But I will not beg." The two brothers looked at each other again. This time something close to respect flickered in their eyes. "Come inside," Caleb said. "I will make coffee. Elijah will come around. He always does. He just takes his time about everything." The younger brother was Silas. Clara learned this as she stepped inside the cabin and absorbed the space that would either become her home or the place where she realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. The main room was larger than she expected. Pine plank floors worn smooth by boot traffic, a massive stone hearth where coals glowed orange, a heavy oak table hand-built 3 inches thick at the surface with 3 chairs around it, each a different size, each built for a different brother. A small bookshelf near the fire held Homer, a Bible with a cracked spine, Melville, and an old medical textbook. The kitchen area had a cast-iron cook stove and a pantry cabinet lined with glass jars. Clara looked at the jars more carefully. Preserved venison, pickled vegetables, honey, dried herbs, each labeled in small, neat handwriting. Caleb's handwriting, she would learn, orderly and precise like Caleb himself. Upstairs, a narrow staircase led to 2 small bedrooms. Clean, minimal, no curtains, no softness, no trace of a woman's presence anywhere in the cabin. Just the hard, functional simplicity of men who had been alone too long. Clara sat at the table. Caleb placed a tin cup of black coffee before her, along with a plate of biscuits and honey. The coffee was the strongest, blackest, most bitter liquid she had ever tasted. She drank it and felt warmth spread through her body like a slow fire. Silas sat across from her, boots on the table, watching without pretense. "So, Miss Bennett, what is a city girl running from who says I am running? Everyone who comes to Redemption Gulch is running from something. Elijah ran from the war. Caleb ran from a broken heart. I ran from a sheriff in Montana who did not appreciate my sense of humor." He grinned. "Your turn." "I am running towards something," Clara said. "A new beginning." Silas raised an eyebrow but did not push. Caleb refilled her coffee, his eyes sympathetic, and did not ask. He came at dusk. The door opened and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of snow and pine and animal sweat. Clara was sitting by the hearth reading the Odyssey, which she had taken from the shelf. She was on book 23, the page where Odysseus returns to Penelope. The page was so worn it was nearly transparent. She looked up, and time stopped. Elijah Stone stood in the doorway. He was not the largest man she had ever seen, but he was the most present. 6 feet 5 shoulders that nearly filled the doorframe, wearing a buffalo hide coat heavy with snow. His chestnut brown hair was wet, tied back, but coming loose around his temples. His jaw was square, shadowed with stubble, set with the permanent tension of a man who kept his teeth clenched against words he refused to say. But it was his eyes that stopped her breathing. Amber, not brown, not gold. Amber like old whiskey held up to firelight. And those eyes swept the room in a single second, cataloging everything missing. Nothing. The fire stoked. Caleb safe. Silas safe. And the stranger sitting in his chair reading his book. I told you I changed my mind, he said. His voice was low, not loud, low, the kind of low that vibrated in Clara's chest before she processed the words, like distant thunder, like the sound a mountain makes before the rock gives way. And I told you it was too late, Caleb replied calmly. She is here, Eli. Then she can get on the wagon and go back. Clara stood. The Odyssey closed in her hand with a sound like a small door shutting. She walked toward him, this monument of a man, and stopped. The top of her head reached his chest. She had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. Mr. Stone, I have traveled 1,700 miles. I have sold the last thing my mother gave me. I have no money, no home, and no one in this world who would notice if I disappeared tomorrow. Her voice did not shake. Inside she was trembling like a leaf in a gale, but outside she was as still as the granite cliffs above the ranch. I did not come here to beg. Your letter promised 3 things, a roof, food, and respect. If you are a man who keeps his word, I stay. If you are not, tell me now. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside. Silas whistled low. Caleb hid a smile behind his coffee. Elijah looked down at the woman standing before him. She was small, so small it was almost absurd, this girl from Philadelphia in her dusty blue dress, her soft hands that had never held an axe clutching his book like a shield. But her eyes did not waver, blue clear and absolutely unblinking. He also saw what she was trying to hide, the thread of fear deep in her gaze. Not fear of him, fear of being sent away. She stays until spring, Elijah said, looking at no one. Trial period. If it does not work, she goes. How generous, Clara said dryly. Elijah looked at her, and for the first time something moved across his stone face. Not a smile. The ghost of a smile. The shadow of a smile. You took my book without asking. You left it on a shelf, not in a vault. Everything in this cabin is in its place, Miss Bennett. Remember that? Clara returned the Odyssey to the shelf precisely where she had found it. Duly noted, Mr. Stone. And that was how it began. Not with warmth, not with welcome, with a negotiation as blunt and practical as a handshake over a cattle sale. Elijah gave Clara his bedroom upstairs. Not out of kindness, she suspected, but because he preferred sleeping on the floor beside the fire to hearing her complain. He laid buffalo robes on the plank floor with the ease of a man who had slept on worse. You do not have to give up your room, Clara started. It is done, he cut her off. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. She did not lock the door. She did not know why. The first week at Stone Ranch taught Clara that everything she knew about the world was built on a foundation of convenience, and that foundation did not exist here. Caleb taught her to start a fire with flint and steel. He knelt beside her at the hearth patient as Stone and showed her how to strike the flint against the steel, or strike or catch the spark on a nest of birch bark tinder and breathe life into it. Not blow, breathe. The trick is not the spark, Caleb explained. It is the breath. Too hard and you blow it out. Too soft and it starves. Just right, like whispering a secret to the fire. She failed 4 times. On the 5th try, the bark caught. The flame licked up, and she felt a joy so small and so pure that it surprised her. In Philadelphia, fire meant striking a match. Here, fire was an achievement. Silas taught her to carry water. The creek was 200 yards from the cabin, clear and cold enough to make her hands ache within seconds. Each bucket weighed 40 pounds. The first time she made it halfway before spilling half the water down her dress. Silas leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching. City hands, you carry those buckets like they personally offended you. Clara set the bucket down, went back to the creek, filled it again, and walked the entire distance without spilling a drop. She did not complain. She did not ask for help. She walked slowly, bent her knees, more used her back instead of her arms, and delivered 2 full buckets to the porch. Silas stopped laughing. When she went back for a second trip, she found 2 full buckets already sitting on the porch. Found some extra, Silas said, not meeting her eyes. Did not want them to go to waste. Clara smiled, but did not say thank you. She had learned already that acknowledging kindness directly was for Silas an insult. Instead, she made an extra plate of honey biscuits that evening, set them beside his place at the table, and said nothing. He ate 6 without comment. That was thank you enough for both of them. She learned the rhythm of the homestead. Each morning before dawn, Elijah went outside, not just to tend livestock. He checked the stable for rot, measured the hay stores, inspected the fences for frost damage, walked the perimeter of the homestead, scanning for animal tracks and signs of weather. Clara watched him through the kitchen window while she heated water for coffee. Every movement was efficient, no wasted step. When he swung an axe to repair a gate, the blade struck exactly where it needed to, no more, no less. This was a man who had built his entire life with his hands, and every callus told a story. Caleb kept the herb garden a small plot beside the cabin that held an astonishing variety. Thyme, sage, peppermint, comfrey for wound salves, foxglove for heart medicine, used carefully, dangerous if the dose was wrong. He kept a leather notebook with meticulous records: which plants to harvest, when, how to dry them, how to brew them, the exact quantities for each remedy. Silas was the outdoor man. He ran the trap lines, tracked deer across the snow with the ease of a man reading a newspaper, and patrolled the homestead perimeter for signs of bear wolf or worse, strangers. A bear you can scare off, Silas told her when she asked why he worried more about human tracks. A man you cannot. On the third evening, Clara cooked dinner. She surveyed the pantry: dried venison cut in large slabs heavy with salt, shriveled potatoes that were still firm enough if she cut away the soft spots, 2 small onions, hard and pungent, 2 cloves of garlic, and Caleb's herb jars lined up like soldiers. She worked the way old Mrs. Harris had taught her in the Crawford kitchen, washed her hands in cold water, sliced the venison thin on the rough wooden cutting board, seasoned it with salt, thyme, and a whisper of sage. Let it sit while she heated beef tallow in the cast iron pot until it shimmered, sautéed the onions and garlic until the cabin filled with a smell that made all 3 brothers stop what they were doing and inhale. She browned the meat, added cubed potatoes, poured in the bone broth that Caleb had been simmering on the back of the stove, a bay leaf, a sprig of thyme, a pinch of dried sage. She adjusted the salt, tasting carefully from a wooden spoon. 3 hours on low heat. The cabin, which normally smelled only of old wood and leather, filled with something different, something that smelled like home. When she placed the bowls on the table, the reaction told her everything she needed to know. Silas ate 2 bowls in 5 minutes and declared without a trace of humor, "She stays forever. I will fight anyone who says otherwise." Caleb ate slowly, eyes closed, savoring. This is what food is supposed to taste like. Elijah sat at the end of the table, silent. He ate his first bowl, then without a word he stood, walked to the stove, and ladled a second helping. He did not compliment her. He did not even look at her. But the second bowl said everything. Clara smiled. It was the first real smile she had allowed herself since leaving Philadelphia. Elijah noticed. She was certain of it because his hand paused on the spoon for just a fraction of a second. The way a man pauses when he hears a sound he has not heard in a very long time and cannot quite identify. On the 4th morning, Clara discovered that Elijah had built her a chair. It was shorter than the other 3 chairs at the table, lower, proportioned for someone who stood 5'3" instead of 6.5 feet tall. It was simple, unadorned, practical, and it had appeared overnight without announcement or explanation. When she asked about it, Elijah did not look up from his coffee. The old one was too tall. You looked ridiculous. But Clara understood. He had measured her height by eye, estimated the proportions, cut the wood, assembled the chair, all in the dark hours before dawn while she slept. That was how Elijah Stone said, "Welcome." Each morning she noticed the fire was already burning when she came downstairs. Each evening the lamp was moved closer to wherever she sat reading. Each night she heard his heavy boots circle the cabin, once, twice, checking every window, every door, before he settled on his robes by the hearth. On the 5th night, after Caleb and Silas had gone upstairs, Clara and Elijah sat at opposite ends of the table. She read. He whittled a piece of wood into what she recognized as a knife handle, his massive hands moving with surprising delicacy. "You read Homer," he said without looking up. It was not a question. "I taught Homer to children in Philadelphia. Book 23. You keep going back to it." He had noticed which pages she returned to. He had been watching more closely than she thought. "It is my favorite passage," Clara said. "A wife who waits, a husband who fights his way back. Do you think stories like that are true?" Elijah was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the shutters. "I think," he said slowly, "that some people are worth fighting back to." He did not look at her when he said it, but Clara felt the words land heavy and warm like a blanket dropped into her lap without ceremony. She wanted to ask more, about Tennessee and the war, about the grief that hung around him like weather. But she knew with the instinct of a woman who had learned to read silence that he would tell her when he was ready. Not tonight. "Thank you for the chair," she said instead. "It is just a chair." "It is not just a chair, and you know it." He glanced at her quick and sharp, and she saw something flicker in those amber eyes. Then he returned to his whittling. But Clara noticed the tips of his ears had gone red, and it was not from the fire. November came, and with it, the first real snow. Elijah needed to take Clara down to Redemption Gulch for fabric and supplies before the trail closed for winter. Caleb and Silas stayed behind to tend the homestead. For the first time, Clara and Elijah would be alone. The wagon trail down the mountain was narrow and treacherous, carved into the cliff face with barely enough room for two mules side by side. On one side, rock wall. On the other, a 300-foot drop into a canyon filled with broken pines. The snow began as flurries, harmless, almost pretty. Clara watched the flakes drift past the mule's ears and felt for a brief moment something close to peace. "Why did you put the advertisement in the paper?" she asked, breaking the silence. "If you did not want a wife." Elijah kept his eyes on the trail. Silas placed the advertisement. "I just signed it." "Why sign something you do not mean?" A long silence. The mules plodded. Snow accumulated on Elijah's hat brim and on Clara's shoulders. "Because Caleb said you sounded desperate in your letter." He paused. "And I know what desperate feels like." Clara turned away so he would not see the water in her eyes. But Elijah had already seen. The storm hit fast. What had been gentle flakes became driving sheets of white. The wind screamed through the canyon like something alive and furious. Temperature dropped so quickly that Clara's thin coat became useless in minutes. Elijah reached behind the seat without looking, grabbed a heavy wool blanket, and dropped it into her lap. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and something else, something warm and masculine that she could not name. Then the world broke apart. A crack like thunder echoed off the canyon walls. Not lightning. The sound of a dead tree snapping. Under the weight of accumulated snow. A massive ponderosa pine crashed onto the trail directly ahead of them, blocking the path completely. The lead mule screamed. Both animals reared, jerking the wagon sideways. The back wheel slipped over the edge of the cliff. The wagon tilted. The sky swung sideways. Clara felt herself sliding. Gravity seized her and pulled her toward the abyss. She clawed at the wooden seat fingernails, tearing against the grain. Her feet found nothing. Empty air. 300 feet of empty air. A hand closed around her wrist. Massive, rough, warm. Fingers like iron bands wrapped around her arm, with a grip that would leave bruises for a week. Elijah held her with one arm while his other arm wrapped around the brake lever. His boots dug into the floorboards, every muscle in his neck and shoulders, straining against the combined weight of Clara and the tilting wagon. He was not just holding her. He was counterbalancing the entire wagon with his body, keeping it from following her over the edge. "Do not let go," Clara screamed, and her voice broke on the last word. "I don't let go, Mace." 3 words. Not a reassurance, not a promise made in the heat of the moment. A statement of fact. A principle of existence. The way gravity pulls downward, Elijah Stone does not let go. With a roar that sounded like something between a man and a force of nature, he hauled her back into the wagon. His arm curled and his shoulder rolled, and he lifted her weight with one hand as if she were made of paper. He threw her onto the floorboards, snapped the reins, shouted at the mules, and drove them forward through the gap beside the fallen tree. The wagon scraped, groaned, and lurched. The back wheel caught, held, rolled forward onto solid ground. Elijah did not stop until they were 100 yards past the danger. He set the brake and slumped forward over the reins, breathing like a man who had just outrun the devil. Clara lay on the floor of the wagon, shaking so violently her teeth chattered in a continuous rattle. She looked up at the giant of a man who had just held her life in one hand and refused to let go. He turned to look at her. The irritation was gone from his eyes. In its place was something raw and adrenaline-fueled and impossible to name. "You all right?" he asked. His voice was rough. "I think so." "Good." He looked at the sky, which had turned black with snow. "We cannot make town. Trail is blocked behind us and too dangerous ahead. My trap cabin, 2 miles off trail. We hold up there until the storm breaks." Clara looked at the dark forest, then at the man. She remembered the grip on her wrist, the absolute refusal to let her fall. "Okay," she said, and she did not know it then, but the storm was only the beginning. The real danger and the real story would unfold in that one-room cabin in the mountains, where a woman from Philadelphia and a man who had sworn off love would discover that the walls they had built to protect themselves were the very things keeping them from living. The trap cabin was not a home. It was a fist of logs clenched against the jaw of winter. One room, one hearth, one bed. Walls of ponderosa pine notched so tight the wind could not find a seam. A stone fireplace that Elijah had built 3 years ago, each rock chosen from the creek bed for its flatness and fitted without mortar. A rough table, one chair, a shelf of canned preserves and dried meat, and outside the storm hammering the shutters with a fury that sounded personal. Elijah kicked the door shut behind them and dropped the heavy timber bar into place. He was covered in snow, crusted white from hat brim to boot heel, and when he shook himself, the cabin floor darkened with meltwater. Clara stood by the hearth shivering so hard her vision blurred. Her dress was soaked through, her boots squished with every step. Her fingers had gone from painful to numb, which she knew from her father's medical conversations was worse. "You are wet," Elijah said. "Not a question, a diagnosis. I am aware. Hypothermia kills faster than wolves." He crossed to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, pulled out a red flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers large enough to fit two of her. He tossed them at her without ceremony. "Change. Hang your dress by the fire." Clara caught the bundle against her chest, her face flushing despite the cold. "I cannot possibly change with you standing right there." Elijah looked at her for one flat second. Then he grabbed a spare blanket and threw it over the rope line strung across one corner of the cabin, creating a curtain that blocked exactly nothing if a person were tall enough to see over it, which Elijah certainly was. "Behind there, I will make coffee." He turned his back to her and began filling the kettle from a water barrel. "Your ankles do not interest me." Behind the blanket, Clara's fingers were so numb she could barely manage the buttons. She peeled the wet layers off her skin, prickling with goose flesh, and pulled on the flannel shirt. It fell to her knees. She had to roll the sleeves 5 times to find her hands. The fabric smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and soap, and it was the warmest thing that she had felt in hours. When she emerged holding her wet dress like a surrender flag, Elijah was sitting at the table with his back to her, whittling. He did not look up. "Coffee is on the hob, dried venison in the pantry. Help yourself." She hung her dress on the chair back near the fire and wrapped both hands around a tin cup of black coffee. It was bitter scalding and the best thing she had ever tasted. "How long will the storm last?" she asked. 3 days, maybe 4. And Caleb and Silas. They will know I brought you here. They will not worry. 3 days, one room, 2 people who had known each other for less than a week. On the first day, Clara cooked. She found the dried venison, 2 shriveled potatoes, a small onion, and Elijah's herb jars. She worked slowly, carefully, turning the crude ingredients into a stew that filled the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. When she placed the bowl in front of Elijah, he tasted it, paused, tasted again. Then he ate the entire bowl without stopping and reached for a second. "You cook like this in Philadelphia?" he asked. "Old Mrs. Harris taught me. She said a woman who can cook will never starve." Smart woman. She also said a man who eats without complimenting the cook deserves burnt biscuits. Elijah looked at her with an expression of absolute seriousness. "The stew is adequate." Clara laughed. The sound burst out of her before she could stop it, bright and genuine, bouncing off the log walls of the tiny cabin. She had not laughed like that since before her father died. The sound surprised her. It surprised Elijah more. He looked at her the way a man looks at the first bird song after a long winter, startled and uncertain whether to trust it. What? Claire asked, catching his expression. Nothing, he said, and went back to his whittling. But his hands did not move for a long time. On the second day, Clara found the handkerchief. She was searching the wooden chest for a darning needle when her fingers touched fabric at the bottom. Soft cotton embroidered with small roses, the initials MS, stitched in the corner. Margaret Stone. Clara held it for a moment, understanding settling over her like snowfall. This was the last piece of another life, a life that ended under an oak tree on the Oregon Trail 10 years ago. Elijah kept it at the bottom of the chest where he could know it was there without having to see it every day. She put it back exactly where she found it. She did not ask about it. That evening by the fire, the conversation turned real. A man travels long enough, he starts to understand Odysseus, Elijah said when Clara read aloud from Homer. Just trying to get home. Is this your home? Clara asked, gesturing to the cabin around them. He looked at the fire. It is where I sleep. Home is something else. Where are you from? Tennessee, before the war. I am from Philadelphia. My father was a minister, a good man. He died 2 years ago. A minister's daughter answering a mail-order advertisement. Elijah studied her. What would he say? He would say, God leads us where we need to be, even when the path makes no sense. Does this make sense to you being here? Clara looked around the cabin. Rough walls, firelight, a giant man carving wood across from her. Nothing in this room belonged to the world she had known. And yet, more sense than anything in a long time, she said. On the third day, the walls cracked. Clara asked about the name the townspeople used. The Beast of the Ridge. Elijah's hands went still on the knife. His jaw tightened. The bear was going after Caleb, he said, voice aflat. 3 years ago, she was a sow with cubs. Caleb surprised her checking traps. I did what needed doing. With your bare hands, with a knife, and luck. He touched his ribs through the flannel where Clara could see the ridge of a scar beneath the fabric. She got me good before she went down. You saved your brother. That is what brothers do. And the beast part. People fear what they do not understand. Big man lives alone, does not smile. Must be a beast. He paused. Maybe they are right. Clara stood. She crossed the small space between them closer than she had ever dared and looked up at him. Close enough to smell the soap he used, the wood smoke in his hair, the coffee on his breath. You are not a beast, Elijah. You are a man who has been alone too long. He looked down at her. The distance between them could be measured in inches. The air in the cabin felt charged the way air feels before lightning finds ground. You do not know me, Clara. Then let me. Time suspended, the fire crackled, snow ticked against the window doors. Neither of them breathed. Then Elijah stepped back. One step. The invisible wall rebuilt itself brick by brick in the space between heartbeats. Storm is breaking tomorrow, he said, turning away. We should rest. Clara stood there, her heart hammering, and asked herself the question she had been avoiding. When did this man stop being a stranger and start becoming the only thing in the world that mattered? They returned to the homestead the next morning. Caleb and Silas were waiting at the gate, relief plain on their faces. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm, and Clara became, without anyone naming it, the center of the Stone family. With Caleb, she found warmth. He taught her about the herb garden, kneeling beside her in the cold dirt, naming each plant and its purpose. He told her about the Shoshone woman he had loved, the one called Singing Bird, who had taught him everything he knew about healing. She found me with a broken leg near her family's summer camp, Caleb said one afternoon as they dried willow bark on the porch. Set the bone herself, nursed me 3 weeks. By the time I could walk, I did not want to leave. What happened? Tuberculosis, 6 months. She made me promise 2 things. Keep learning the plants, and do not close my heart. Clara placed her hand on his arm. Have you kept both promises? Caleb looked at her hand, then at her face. His eyes glistened, but his smile was steady. The first one, yes. The second is harder. He paused. Elijah is the one who needs you, Clara. Not me. I have my brothers, my plants, and now a sister. That is more than enough. With Silas, she found laughter. The youngest Stone was wildfire in human form, ungovernable and unapologetic, but beneath the swagger was a loyalty so fierce it bordered on holy. He taught her to shoot. Standing behind her, adjusting her grip on the heavy revolver, his voice dropping to an instructor's calm. Steady. Breathe. Squeeze. Do not pull. She missed. Badly. Again, pretend the target is whoever you are running from. Clara went still. Then she raised the pistol, aimed and fired. The tin can flew off the fence post. Good girl, Silas said quietly. Then the grin returned. Now do it 10 more times. In return, Clara taught Silas to read. The wildest of the Stone brothers sat rigid at the kitchen table each evening, biting his tongue, tracing letters with a finger that was more comfortable holding a skinning knife. When he read his first complete sentence, "The sun is up," his face lit with a brightness Clara had never seen. I read that, he whispered. I read a whole damn sentence. Language, Clara said. But she was smiling and she turned the page. With Elijah, she found depth. Not through words, because Elijah did not trade in words. Through the language of action that men of his generation spoke fluently. The small rituals she had noticed during her first week had not stopped. They had deepened. Now there was always always a cup of hot water waiting beside the stove when she came down, not just a fire. The woodpile beside the back door appeared one morning stacked low enough that she could reach the top without stretching, and she knew he had measured it against her height the way he had measured her chair. He checked her boots each night, turning them upside down near the fire to dry without ever mentioning it. Elijah Stone did not speak the language of tenderness. He built it. He chopped it. He stacked it where she could find it. One evening when Caleb and Silas had gone upstairs, Clara confronted him. You check the perimeter every morning. You have done it since the day I arrived. Elijah did not look up from his Bible. Habit. More thoroughly since I have been here. Silence. A man protects his homestead, he said. Is that all I am? Part of the homestead? He looked at her then, long and direct, and with something in those amber eyes that made her pulse stutter. No, Clara, you are not part of the homestead. You are the reason I still care if it stands. That was the closest Elijah Stone would ever come to saying I love you, and it carried more weight than any 3 words she had ever heard. December brought the coldest night since Clara's arrival, and with the cold came the wolves. The howling woke her from sleep, rising above the wind, not the lonely cry of a single animal, but the coordinated baying of a hunting pack. Hungry, desperate, close. Elijah was on his feet before Clara had processed the sound, Winchester in hand, moving with the fluid speed of a man whose body had been trained by war. Stay inside. Bar the door. Caleb was already pulling on his coat, shotgun in hand. Silas dropped from the loft, 2 knives already drawn, eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly like excitement. How many? Silas asked. 8, maybe 10. They smell the cattle. The 3 brothers vanished into the dark. Clara stood at the door, heart slamming, listening to the sounds of chaos outside. Gunshots cracked the night air, snarling, shouting, the terrified bellowing of cattle and the high screams of panicked horses. She grabbed the iron fire poker cooker and the lantern. She could not stand there. She was not built for standing still while people she cared about fought for their lives. She cracked the door open. In the swirling snow, lit by muzzle flashes and the orange bloom of a torch, she saw Elijah. He stood before the stable gate torch in one hand, rifle firing with the other. 4 gray shapes circled him, massive timber wolves, ribs showing through winter-thinned fur. Caleb fired from behind the hay barn. Silas crouched near the woodpile, moving low and fast, more wolf than man himself. One of the wolves, smaller and quicker than the rest, slipped behind Elijah while he was aiming at another. Clara saw it. Time slowed to the rhythm of her heartbeat. Behind you. Her scream tore through the night like a blade. Elijah spun, but the wolf was already airborne. Its jaws clamped onto his left forearm, the arm with the old war scar, and its weight drove him back a step. Elijah roared, dropped the rifle, and closed his free hand around the wolf's throat. Silas was there in an instant, knife flashing one clean stroke. The wolf went limp. The remaining pack, seeing their leader fall, scattered into the darkness. Elijah stood in the blood-stained snow, breathing hard, his left arm hanging at his side, blood dripping steadily from the torn sleeve. Inside the cabin, Clara had water boiling before they came through the door. She had found the needle and thread. She had found clean linen. She had found the whiskey. The bite was deep, flesh torn. It needed stitching, and Clara had never stitched a wound in her life, only watched her father do it 100 times. Let me see, she said, and pushed Elijah into a chair. The giant sat. It was the first time he had obeyed her, and the significance was not lost on either of them. She cleaned the wound with boiling water. She poured whiskey over the torn flesh. Elijah hissed through his teeth, but did not move. "For the arm or for you?" she asked, holding up the bottle. "For the arm." A beat. "Pour me a glass too," she stitched. 12 sutures, each one precise, each one steady, though her hands trembled. Her father would have been proud. Throughout all the 12 stitches, Elijah did not watch the needle. He watched her face, the concentration line between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip. The strand of honey blonde hair that had fallen across her temple darkened with sweat. When she tied the last knot and wrapped the bandage, she looked up. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath on her skin. "You have good hands," he said softly. "Philadelphia's loss." "You could have been killed," Clara whispered, and now the fear came delayed flooding in as the adrenaline receded. "Hazard of the trade." "Do not say that. Do not make it sound like nothing." Her eyes burned. "You almost died, Elijah." He reached up with his uninjured hand and tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek for one heartbeat. Rough skin against soft. The lightest touch in the world, and it carried the force of an avalanche. Then he pulled back. "Get some sleep." Neither of them slept. Clara lay upstairs, touching her cheek where his fingers had been. Elijah lay downstairs on his buffalo robes and for the first time in 10 years spoke to God. Not a formal prayer, just a quiet word sent upward through the cabin roof asking for something he had not dared to want since an oak tree on the Oregon Trail. 3 days after the wolves, the sickness came. Clara woke shivering with a violence that had nothing to do with cold. Her face burned, her chest ached, her body pushed past its limits by weeks of exposure and stress, and a constitution not built for Wyoming winters finally broke. Caleb placed his hand on her forehead and swore softly under his breath. "Pneumonia," he said, "if the fever does not break by morning." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. 3 brothers took shifts. Caleb brewed medicines from willowbark echinacea and a precious drop of laudanum from his emergency supply. Silas kept the fire blazing. Hauled water maintained the practical machinery of survival. But it was Elijah who sat beside her bed and refused to move. In her delirium, Clara confessed everything. The brooch, Penelope, Harrison Crawford. The night he blocked the doorway and offered her a choice that was no choice at all. Every secret she had carried across 1,700 miles spilled out in fragments, and Elijah caught everyone. On the second night, the crisis came. Clara's breathing turned shallow and wet, a rattling sound that Caleb recognized and feared. He gave her the last of his medicine and went downstairs exhausted. Silas slept by the fire, maintaining the flames even in sleep instinct, doing what consciousness could not. Elijah sat alone beside Clara's bed. He held her hand, small and burning with fever inside his massive scarred grip. He felt her pulse, rapid, weak, irregular, and each pause between beats was a chasm. "Don't you do this," he whispered. "Don't you dare die on me." He squeezed her hand until his knuckles went white. "My name is Elijah James Stone. I had a wife named Margaret. Red hair, freckles. She laughed at everything, even my cooking, which she said could poison a mule." His voice broke. He pressed on. "And a daughter, Ruth, 2 years old, amber eyes like mine. She used to hold onto my leg when I walked, and I would drag her across the floor, and she would laugh." He lowered his forehead to their joined hands. "Cholera, on the Oregon Trail, July of 1864. Both of them same night. Margaret went first 3 in the morning. She was holding Ruth. I had to pry Ruth from her arms." He inhaled. "Ruth went at dawn. I held her. She was so small, Clara, smaller than your hand." He raised his head. Tears ran down his face, silent, disappearing into his beard. "I built this cabin to die alone. I thought if I did not love anyone, I could not lose anyone. It made sense. For 10 years it made sense. But you walked in here with your blue dress and your Homer and your damn stew, and you made me remember what it felt like to want someone to come home to." He squeezed her hand. "You fight Clara Bennett. A man keeps his word, and I am telling you now, I don't let go. Not today, not ever." Then Elijah Stone, the man who had turned his back on God and civilization and hope, prayed, Not a formal prayer with proper words, just, please, please, do not take her from me. I will do anything. Please. Simple, raw, the most honest words he had ever spoken. By morning, the fever broke. Clara opened her eyes to pale winter light in a cabin that smelled of willow bark and wood smoke. Elijah was slumped in the chair beside her head on his chest, dark circles carved beneath his eyes, his beard unkempt. He looked like a man who had fought something terrible and won by the narrowest margin. Elijah, she croaked. His head snapped up. He was at her side in 2 strides, hand on her forehead. Cool, clammy, but the fire was gone. He let out a breath that shook his entire body, sat on the edge of the bed, and covered his face with his hands. The giant trembled. I am alive, she whispered. You scared the hell out of me, woman. You took care of me. Someone had to. She reached for his hand, scarred callous twice the size of hers. I heard you, Elijah. I heard every of them. Margaret, Ruth, the oak tree. He stiffened, tried to pull away. Fever dreams. Elijah. Nobody calls me that, not since my wife. Clara held his hand tighter. What happened to Margaret was not your fault. You did not bring the cholera. You did not choose for them to die. I should have done something. You should have done what died with them. Then who would have built this cabin? Who would have raised Caleb and Silas? Who would have saved me on that cliff? He looked at her. The walls, every wall he had spent a decade building, stone by stone, silence by silence, crumbled. I reckon you are right, he said quietly. He leaned forward. His forehead touched hers. Eyes closed. 2 people breathing the same air. Everything that needed to be said passing between them without words. Get your strength back, Clara. Winter always ends. January arrived. Clara recovered, and the homestead settled into its warmest rhythm since Margaret Stone had died a decade ago. But the warmth would not last, because 600 miles east, Harrison Crawford had not stopped looking. He had hired investigators, bribed a judge in Laramie for a warrant, and tracked Clara's trail from Philadelphia to Cheyenne to Redemption Gulch. Silas brought the news home from a supply run, his face stripped of its usual mischief. Someone has been asking about a woman in Redemption Gulch. City man, expensive suit, paying for information. Clara went white. The coffee cup in her hand trembled. Elijah looked at her. Crawford, she nodded. He found me. Not yet, Elijah said, and his voice was cold steel. How far, Silas? Laramie, 2 days' ride. He is hiring men. Elijah stood. He looked at Caleb, then at Silas. Communication passed between the 3 brothers without a single word, the language of men who shared blood and 10 years of mountain survival. He comes here, he deals with all 3 of us, Silas said, hand drifting to his knife. We do not go looking for trouble, Caleb said, but we do not run from it either. Elijah looked at Clara. Nobody is taking you anywhere. You understand nobody. Clara looked at the 3 of them. 3 men standing between her and a past that wanted to swallow her whole. 3 men who had not asked for proof of her innocence, had not demanded an explanation, had simply drawn a line and dared the world to cross it. I understand, she said. But even as she spoke, she knew the peace was ending. Harrison Crawford was coming. And the test that would determine whether this mountain family survived was already riding toward them through the winter dark. He came in early March when the first melt had softened the trail just enough for horses. Clara was feeding the chickens in the front yard, scattering dried corn from a wooden bucket when she heard the hoofbeats. Distant at first, then closer, growing from a murmur into a rhythm that did not belong to this mountain. She looked up. Half a mile down the trail, 3 riders emerged from the tree line. The man in front sat his horse the way city men always sat horses, stiff-backed and deliberate, controlling the animal rather than moving with it. He wore a dark coat that caught the pale morning light. He carried a silver-headed cane. Clara knew the silhouette before she could see the face. She had spent 3 years watching that silhouette cross drawing rooms in Philadelphia, always positioned between her and the nearest door. The bucket slipped from her hands. Corn scattered across the frozen dirt. The chickens descended in a frenzy of pecking, oblivious to the fact that their world was about to change. He is here! Clara ran for the cabin, her voice cracking against the cold air. Harrison, he is here! The Stone brothers moved like a single organism. No wasted motion, no wasted words. 10 years of living and working and surviving together had welded them into something that operated below the level of conscious thought. Elijah grabbed the Winchester from the wall rack, checked the magazine with one hand while reaching for his hat with the other, and walked through the front door. He stood in the center of the porch, the command position. Caleb took the shotgun from behind the door, confirmed the loads, and stepped out to Elijah's left. He did not speak. He nodded once. Silas needed nothing from the walls. His knives were already on him, two blades that caught the morning light like the eyes of a predator. He took the right flank, arms crossed, and settled into an easy stance that radiated a very specific message. He was not nervous. He was eager. Clara stood in the doorway behind them, her heart hammered, but she did not retreat into the cabin. She had run from Harrison Crawford once. She had run from Philadelphia, from the accusation, from everything. She was done running. Crawford halted his horse 50 yards from the porch. He dismounted with careful, practiced movements. His suit was pinstriped, tailored in London, absurdly out of place against the mud and timber and mountain granite. His boots were polished to mirrors. His silver cane tapped the frozen ground as he walked forward. Behind him, two hired gunmen stayed, mounted hands resting on holstered pistols. But Crawford himself had changed. Clara saw it immediately. He was thinner. The elegant cheekbones she remembered that had become gaunt hollows. His gray eyes, always cold and controlled, now held something feverish. 6 months of tracking her across the continent had peeled away the civilized veneer, and what remained underneath was something rawer and more dangerous than the man she had fled. "Clara, darling," he called. His voice, once smooth as silk, now carried a tremor at the edges. "You have led me on quite a chase." Clara stepped forward until she stood just behind Elijah's shoulder. She lifted her chin. "I am not your darling, Harrison. I never was." Crawford raised a folded document. "I have a warrant for your arrest, signed by Judge Whitfield of Laramie, grand theft. You will come with me, or these gentlemen will be charged with harboring a fugitive. That warrant is a lie, and you know it." Clara's voice did not waver. The girl who had trembled in Philadelphia drawing rooms was gone. In her place stood a woman who had survived blizzards, stitched wolf bites, and stared down death in a fever bed. "Your sister took the brooch. You know she did. You watched Penelope put it in my vanity, and you said nothing because you thought it would make me need you." Crawford's jaw tightened. She had struck the truth, and they both knew it. "What I know," he said, the last pretense of civility falling away like dead bark, "is that you belong to me. You were promised to me, and I always collect what is mine." Elijah stepped forward. One step. A single step that covered the distance of a normal man's 3. The porch boards groaned under his weight. "She ain't going anywhere," Elijah said. His voice was not raised. It was low, quiet, the frequency of distant thunder, the kind of sound a man feels in his ribs before his ears process it. "And she ain't yours." "And who are you?" Crawford looked up at the mountains standing before him and attempted a sneer. "Her keeper. Her family." Caleb stepped up on Elijah's left. "Family." His voice was calm, but his eyes, normally warm as hearth fire, had gone cold. Caleb rarely showed anger. When he did, it meant every peaceful option had been exhausted. Silas stepped up on the right. "Family." He smiled. It was the most unsettling thing about the entire confrontation. Silas was smiling the way a wolf smiles at a rabbit that has wandered too far from its burrow. 3 brothers, nearly 20 feet of combined height, armed, battle-tested, and standing shoulder to shoulder with the immovable certainty of men defending the only thing that mattered. Crawford looked at them. Then he looked at Clara standing behind the wall of her family, and in that moment something broke behind his eyes. He saw what he had refused to see. Clara was not a prisoner here. She was home. That recognition did not stop him. It drove him over the edge. "Take her!" Crawford screamed. What followed lasted less than 60 seconds. The scarred gunman on the left reached for his holster. Silas moved, his arm blurred. The knife spun twice and buried itself in the porch post 2 inches from the gunman's ear. The man froze, hand trembling on his pistol grip. The younger gunman panicked. Drew. Fired. The bullet chipped the post beside Clara's head, close enough for splinters to scratch her cheek. A single drop of blood. Elijah saw it. He did not shout. He did not draw his weapon. He walked forward with the unstoppable deliberation of gravity, grabbed Harrison Crawford by the lapels of his London suit with one hand, and lifted him clear off the ground. "Listen carefully." Elijah set his face inches from Crawford's. Go back east. Tell them she died in the storm. Tell them the wolves got her. A man keeps his word, and my word is this: if I ever see you in these mountains again, I will bury you where the spring thaw will not find you. He released his grip. Crawford fell into the snow, scrambled backward, and ran for his horse. His hired men, bruised and terrified, followed. They rode hard down the trail and did not look back. Elijah watched until the dust settled. Then he turned to Clara. Gently, with a hand that could crush stone, he touched her cheek where the splinter had drawn blood. He hurt you, he said quietly. It is a scratch. He will be back. Men like him do not stop. We need to disappear. They abandoned the homestead the next day. Caleb stayed behind to tend the livestock and misdirect anyone who came asking. Elijah, Clara, and Silas climbed into the high country, past the timber line, into the world of rock and ice, where the air burned to breathe and nothing grew except lichen and will. Eagle's Nest was a cave system hidden behind a frozen waterfall, a curtain of blue ice that caught the light and scattered it like shattered glass. Inside the cave was dry, sheltered from wind, with a natural vent that carried smoke upward and out. Elijah had fortified it over the years with stacked stone walls and animal hide flooring. It was his fortress of last resort. 2 months on the mountain changed Clara in ways that Philadelphia could never have imagined. Her soft hands calloused, her stride steadied. She learned to set snares to skin rabbits, to read weather in the color of the sky. The woman who had once carried water buckets like they personally offended her now hauled them without thought. Silas taught her to track. Clara taught Silas to read longer sentences by firelight, their breath fogging in the cold. And Elijah slowly allowed himself to be known. One evening, wrapped in buffalo robes near the fire, Clara read Homer aloud. Book 23, The Reunion. When she finished, she looked up and found Elijah watching her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Open, unguarded, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. He kissed her, slowly, carefully, the way a man touches something sacred that he is afraid will break. His hands cupped her face, rough palms against soft skin, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright. I am afraid, Clara, not of bears or wolves or gunmen. I am afraid of this, of you, of what happens when I lose you. Then do not lose me. You make it sound simple. Maybe love is simple. Maybe it is the rest of the world that complicates it. That night, the hide curtain across the alcove fell closed. Outside, the wind screamed against the mountain. Inside, there was warmth. There was shelter. There was a man and a woman who had found each other at the end of the world. When morning came, everything had changed between them. Silas, sleeping at the cave mouth with the easy instincts of a man who had spent his life outdoors, smiled in his sleep. He knew. He was glad. His eldest brother deserved this. The snow was melting when Clara's body told her the truth. She was kneeling at the stream near the cave entrance, filling the water bucket when the smell of pine resin, usually clean and sharp, turned her stomach inside out. She dropped the bucket and retched into the snow. She sat back on her heels, counted again. Mathematics does not lie, not in Philadelphia and not on the peak of the Bighorn Mountains. She walked back into the cave. Elijah was sharpening his skinning knife, firelight sliding along the steel. He looked up as she entered, and she saw his eyes narrow, reading her the way he read weather and animal tracks, and every other signal the mountain sent him. You are sick, he said. Not exactly. She sat across from him. Elijah, we need to talk. The knife stopped moving. I am on with child. The silence that followed was geological, ancient, as heavy as the stone walls surrounding them. Elijah's face drained of color. The knife slipped from his fingers and clattered on the rock floor. He stood and backed away until he hit the cave wall. No, he said, his voice cracking. I told you, I cannot do this again. It happened, it is real, and it is ours. It will die, the cold, the wolves, Crawford. It will die, Clara, and it will take you with it. It will not. Clara slammed her palm against her own chest. Because you will protect us. You fought a grizzly for Caleb. You fought a wolf pack for mules. Will you do less for your own child? Before Elijah could answer, the sound of gunfire echoed up the canyon. Then another shot, and another. Silas appeared at the cave mouth, knives drawn face hard. Riders in the valley. A dozen, maybe more. Crawford is back. Elijah looked at Clara, at her stomach, at her eyes. In that single moment, every wall he had ever built, every vow of solitude, every year of deliberate emptiness, collapsed. What replaced it was older than grief and stronger than fear. The instinct that has driven men since the first child was born in the first cave at the edge of the first wilderness. "You are pregnant," he said. It was no longer a question. "Yes." He racked the lever of the Winchester. The sound was final, metallic, certain. He crossed to her, placed both hands on her shoulders, and kissed her forehead. Hard, decisive. "Then I guess I cannot die today." His voice dropped to a growl. "I don't let go. For you, for the little one, for everything." The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The father had awakened, and the father was very, very angry. "Get the ammunition," he said. "I am going to end this." What followed Clara experienced from inside the cave. She did not see the battle. She heard it. She felt it. She counted. Each crack of Elijah's Winchester, precise and evenly spaced, was a heartbeat she could track. Each burst of return fire, ragged and panicked, told her the enemy was losing cohesion. Silas was somewhere on the eastern slope, silent and lethal, doing what Silas did best. Clara sat in the dark, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the revolver Elijah had left her. "We will survive this," she whispered to the life inside her. "Your father is coming back. He does not let go." Then came the explosion. Dynamite. The mountain shook to its roots. A sound deeper than thunder followed, a sound like the earth taking a breath and deciding to rearrange itself. Avalanche. The shock wave hit the cave. Snow blasted through the entrance, sealing it in darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. Clara crawled through the black, blind death from the concussion, finding her way by touch. Her hands found snow. Fresh wet forced through the cave mouth by the avalanche. She dug. Fingernails broke. Skin tore. She kept digging until she touched fabric. Buffalo hide. His coat. He was lying near the entrance, half buried. He had run toward the cave, not away from it. In the last second before the mountain came down, he had chosen to run toward her. She cleared the snow from his face. Cold. Too cold. She pressed her ear to his chest, tearing at his coat buttons to get closer. Thump, 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 slow, faint. But there. "I don't let go," she whispered. And this time the words were hers, spoken to him in the dark, with the mountain pressing down on them both. 3 weeks they were buried. 3 weeks of digging through 20 feet of snow, with frozen hands surviving on the last of the dried meat and water from melted snow. Elijah's ribs were cracked. Clara's hands bled and healed and bled again. But they dug, together, side by side. "You should rest," Elijah said. "You should stop telling me what to do," Clara answered and kept digging. On the 18th day, light broke through, a thin, weak beam that fell on Clara's face like grace. On the 21st day, they emerged. The world was white and silent. The avalanche had buried the valley floor under tons of snow, erasing every trace of Crawford, his hired men, and his horses. The mountain had judged. The mountain had decided. Silas found them 3 days later, alive, battered one arm, in a makeshift sling, grinning through cracked lips. His eyes went wide when he saw Clara's belly. "Is she?" Elijah nodded and smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, the real thing. Silas knelt in the snow, placed his good hand on Clara's stomach, and whispered, "Hey, little one. I am Uncle Wild. I am going to teach you everything." "Everything appropriate," Clara corrected. "Details." They came down the mountain in late spring. Caleb was waiting. The marshal from Laramie had ruled the deaths an accident, a foolish party caught in an avalanche. He had asked Caleb about a school teacher named Bennett. Caleb told him she died in the storm. The reunion of the three brothers was brief and wordless. Caleb embraced Elijah, which he had done perhaps 5 times in their adult lives. Silas got a slap on the back that nearly knocked him over, and Clara got Caleb's warmest smile and 3 words that meant more than 1,000. "Welcome home, Clara." On a quiet evening after supper, with Caleb and Silas conveniently absent, Elijah produced a silver ring from his shirt pocket. Simple. Hammered from a silver dollar over 3 nights at the forge, his massive fingers struggling with work meant for a jeweler's hands. Inside 2 letters, E and C. I told the marshal Miss Bennett died in the storm, he said. His voice was rough, and Clara realized with a start that it was rough because it was shaking. This man who had faced wolves and gunmen and avalanches was trembling. I told him the only woman up here is Mrs. Stone. He looked at her, amber eyes open, vulnerable, terrified. I know I am not what you deserved. I am rough, hard. I talk in grunts and express love through furniture. Clara laughed through tears. I will probably make you angry more days than not, but a man keeps his word. And my word is, I will never let anyone hurt you, not while I breathe. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was too big. Of course it was. His hands were so large he could not comprehend how small her fingers were. It is too big, she said, laughing. I will fix it. Do not you dare. I love it exactly as it is. I take you, Clara, under this mountain and the God I forgot for 10 years. And I take you, Elijah James Stone, all of you, the scars, the silence, the nightmares, the grunts, the furniture, all of it. He kissed her, and when he pulled back, the giant smiled. A real smile, wide and warm, that transformed his granite face into something young and almost gentle. A smile that had been missing for 10 years, since Margaret and Ruth, since the oak tree on the Oregon Trail. Now it was back, because of Clara. Outside the window, Silas wiped his eyes. Dust. Just dust. Caleb smiled. Sure it is. Hope was born in July. Caleb delivered the baby with steady hands and knowledge passed down from a Shoshone woman who had loved him. 12 hours. Clara gripped Elijah's hands so hard her knuckles went white, and Elijah stood beside her, face whiter than the snow on the peaks, unable to fight or build or fix or do anything except hold on. Wolves are easier, he muttered, and wolves you can punch. Then came the cry, high and clear, and new rising from the cabin on the slope of the Bighorn Mountains, carrying through the open window, past the ponderosa pines up into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The first sound of a life that had been fought for, bled for, prayed for. Caleb placed the baby in Elijah's arms. A girl, 7 pounds, red-faced, wrinkled fists, clenched lungs working perfectly. Elijah looked down at his daughter. His hands, which could swing an axe through oak, which had gripped a wolf by the throat, which had hauled Clara back from a 300-foot drop, cradled 7 pounds of life with the delicacy of a man holding blown glass. The baby opened her eyes. Blue. Her mother's eyes. Elijah cried. No sound, no sobbing. Just tears running silent down his weathered face, catching in his beard, falling onto the blanket wrapped around his daughter. He thought of Ruth, 2 years old, amber eyes like his, dead in his arms at dawn on the Oregon Trail. July 1864, 10 years ago, same month. He had believed his heart died with her. He had been wrong. His heart had only been sleeping, waiting for a reason to wake. Hope, Clara whispered from the bed. Her name is Hope. Elijah looked at his daughter, then at his wife, then at his brothers standing in the doorway, Caleb with red eyes, Silas biting his lips so hard it nearly bled. Welcome home, little one, Elijah said, his voice broken and whole at the same time. I don't let go. And now the years began to unspool the way years do, faster than you expect and richer than you deserve. The first spring, Clara planted a garden. 10 rows, 6 vegetables, 2 herbs, 2 wildflowers. Lupine purple as a bruise transplanted from the meadow. Elijah asked why she wasted space on flowers. She said, because food feeds the body, but beauty feeds the soul. He said nothing. The following week, she found a small fence built around the flower bed to keep the rabbits out. Caleb married a widow named Emmeline. In the 3rd year, a quiet woman with kind eyes and a 4-year-old son named Micah. They built a cabin 100 yards from the main house, close enough to share Sunday dinners. Far enough for privacy. Silas stayed in the big house. Someone has got to keep this place from falling apart, he said. The truth was simpler. This was his home, and Clara and Hope were his family, and Silas Stone did not leave his family. By the 5th year, Hope was 4 years old, honey-haired like her mother, amber-eyed like her father, stubborn as both. She called Caleb Uncle Herb and Silas Uncle Wild, and both names were perfect. By the 10th year, the Sunday dinner table had been expanded twice. Elijah, Clara, Hope, Caleb, Emmeline, Micah, and Caleb's twins, Rosalie and Nathaniel. Silas sat at the opposite end from Elijah, presiding over the chaos with the satisfied air of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted without admitting he wanted it. By the 20th year, a hard winter killed 4 head of cattle and collapsed the hay barn roof. Elijah and Clara stood in the snow looking at the wreckage. His hair was streaked with silver. Her hands, once soft enough to make Silas laugh, were calloused and strong. "Winter always ends," Clara said, taking his hand. "We will rebuild," he said. And they did, because that is what you do. Not because it is easy, but because it is who you are. Hope married Garrett Mercer in 1899, a rancher's son, tall and kind, and smart enough to learn Greek when Hope told him it mattered. Elijah sat on the porch and interrogated the young man with the quiet intensity of a grizzly evaluating whether to charge. "Can you build?" "Yes, sir." "Can you read?" "Yes, sir." Good, because my daughter reads Homer in Greek, and if you cannot keep up, she will leave you in the dust." The young man swallowed. "I will learn Greek if I have to, sir." Elijah studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "A man keeps his word. Can you keep yours?" "Always, sir." "Then you have my blessing." The wedding was on the porch, the same porch where Caleb had married Emmeline 22 years before. Clara cried. Silas wiped his eyes and blamed the dust. Elijah stood beside his wife, arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in decades he thought of Margaret and Ruth without pain. Only gratitude, because the first love had taught him how to love, and the second love had taught him how to live. In 1909, Hope's daughter was born. Honey blonde hair, amber eyes. Hope named her Clara. When Elijah held his granddaughter for the first time, 68 years old with white hair and hands still strong enough to split oak, he whispered what he had whispered to her mother in the same cabin 15 years before. "I don't let go, little one." The years kept coming. Caleb's garden grew into a small apothecary that served the entire valley. Silas, 62 and still splitting wood shirtless every morning because cold keeps me sharp, had become the unlikely patriarch of the next generation, teaching Hope's children and Caleb's grandchildren to ride and track and tell stories that grew more outrageous with each retelling. And Clara and Elijah sat on the porch every evening in the wide rocking chair he had built for himself, watching the sun go down behind the Bighorn Mountains. Two people who had found each other at the end of the world and built a life so solid that 40 years of weather could not shake it. "You still check the perimeter every morning," Clara said. "Habit. You have been saying that for 40 years. Some habits are worth keeping." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of 40 winters, survived 40 springs, welcomed a daughter, raised grandchildren, loved, and a promise kept every single day without fail. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not letting go." He tightened his arm around her. "I don't let go." 40 years, the same 3 words, never once broken, and now we are back where we began. The porch, the rocking chair, the evening light on the Bighorn Mountains, turning the peaks to gold and rose, and finally deep violet. Little Clara, 5 years old, sat in her grandfather's lap, looking up at her grandmother, with eyes that held the same stubborn spark that had walked off a stagecoach into ankle-deep mud 40 years ago. "Grandma, tell me the part where Grandpa said he does not let go." Clara looked at Elijah. 64 looked at 73. Blue eyes met amber. After 40 years, that look could still make her heart skip, just as it had the first time he stood in the cabin doorway covered in snow, radiating disapproval and something deeper that neither of them had been ready to name. "He said it the first time on a mountain trail when I was falling off a cliff, and he caught me with one hand. He said it when I was sick and he thought I might die. He said it the night he asked me to marry him. And he said it the first time he held your mother." "I don't let go either, Grandpa," the little girl said, wrapping her arms around his neck. Elijah held his granddaughter against his chest. His hands, scarred and weathered, still large, still powerful, cradled her with the same tenderness he had shown when he held Hope for the first time. He looked at Clara over the child's honey blonde head, and his eyes, amber and bright and alive, said everything that 40 years of living together had taught him words could never quite capture. "Winter always ends," he said softly. "Winter always ends," Clara answered. The sun slipped behind the mountains. Fireflies began to rise from the meadow where lupine grew wild, now purple flowers spreading from the 2 rows Clara had planted in 1875, until they covered the entire valley floor. Somewhere down the slope, Micah's cattle lowed in the evening cool. Somewhere in the cabin, Silas was arguing with one of the grandchildren about the proper way to hold a fishing rod. The old woman who had once been a terrified girl from Philadelphia who had sold her mother's locket to buy a train ticket west, who had answered a blunt three-line advertisement because it was the first honest thing anyone had said to her in years, closed her eyes. She listened to the heartbeat beneath her husband's flannel shirt, steady and strong, the same rhythm that had kept her alive in a dark cave under 20 feet of snow. This mountain chose you, old Pete had said 40 years ago. He was right. The mountain had chosen her. And she had chosen the mountain and the three men on it right back. She still remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing. 40 years later, standing on the porch he built with his own hands, watching their granddaughter chase fireflies through the wildflowers, she knew the truth that old Pete had seen before anyone else. That was not the day her old life ended. That was the day her real life began. If you enjoyed this story of rugged devotion and frontier love, please hit that like button. It truly helps the channel grow. Subscribe and ring that bell so you do not miss our next adventure. Coming soon, a tale of a shipwrecked widow and the lighthouse keeper who found her on the rocks off the coast of Maine. You will not want to miss it.